If you've been anywhere near the Warcraft community in the past couple of days, you've probably noticed the conversation around the new housing cinematic that Blizzard released, or more like the controversy at this point. Not that the discussion of the game's seeming loss of identity has ever really gone away, but it was once again pushed to the forefront. You pretty much have two sides. One says that this doesn't feel like Warcraft anymore, that the game has become too safe, too bright and whimsical, and nothing like the grim fantasy setting that originally inspired it. And the Pixar-like tone of the cinematic is just but another symptom of that. The other camp says that people are either overreacting or they just don't see the shift in the game's tone as a problem. As my goat Karosh himself once said, times change, and maybe the old heads just need to get over themselves and enjoy the game for what it is now. So where do I sit on this personally? Well, I don't think that you can deny that the overall tone of the game has changed over the years. Yes, Warcraft has always had its lighter moments to break up the heavier ones, even going back to the RTS games, but now it almost seems like the inverse is true. I say almost because it wouldn't be fair to claim modern Warcraft is nothing but silliness. That's just not true. The game is definitely more vibrant than it used to be and less gritty, but the darker elements haven't disappeared entirely. They're still there, it's just that the ratio has shifted. Honestly, I can't think of another franchise that changes this much from expansion to expansion the way World of Warcraft does. Sometimes just moving between zones can feel like you're playing an entirely different game. At least thematically, of course, gameplay-wise that doesn't apply as much. But is that really a bad thing? It feels like a straight yes or no answer strips away all of the nuance and turns it into a matter of personal preference. And don't get me wrong, of course I'm not pretending my own view isn't objective either, but saying I don't like this because it's not like it used to be isn't really conducive to a conversation. Because like, what do you say to that? There will be just as many people saying, well, I like it how it is currently, so sucks to be you, I guess. As someone who grew up playing Warcraft 2 and 3, I will fully admit that I prefer when WoW was closer in tone to that, but I don't hold that preference in a vacuum or as some kind of ideological stance. Let's be honest, a lot of the people who play Warcraft today weren't even alive when the RTS games came out, so getting upset that their introduction to this world isn't the same as yours or mine, and thus they don't have the same ties to it that we do, is just a shallow way of thinking in my opinion. Plus, they can always make the argument that classic is a thing now, so you always have the alternative if you hate retail that much. There's also some complaints about modern Warcraft I've seen that are just plain illogical. For example, I don't necessarily like where the lore is going, but you can't honestly tell me that it's not more original than what we had before. Early Warcraft was basically a ripoff of Warhammer Fantasy. If you didn't know, Blizzard actually wanted to make a Warhammer RTS but couldn't secure the rights, so they sort of created their own very similar universe with slight subversions. Now, I do like Warhammer Fantasy a lot, so I'm not complaining, but let's be real here. So in terms of distancing itself from its inspiration, current Warcraft is a lot more distinctive. That said, just because something is more original doesn't automatically make it better. All those fantasy cliches are cliches for a reason. They've stood the test of time because they, well, work. It's how you use them that makes or breaks a story. Here is where I side with the more traditionalist crowd, and feel free to disagree, but Blizzard has never really been great at doing its own thing. They've always excelled at cherry-picking what works and putting their own spin on it, and that goes for their storytelling as well. The contemporary game, I would agree, feels directionless. It's constantly at odds with the very foundation it was built on. It has conflict as its central themes, yet both factions and the races within feel more homogenized than ever. Playing on a PvP server almost feels like you're actively breaking the lore at this point because there's little to no real tension between the Horde and the Alliance anymore. The dangers are all external, often cosmic in scale. From that aspect, the factions working together makes logical sense, of course, but if you're going to do that, you might as well just rebrand the franchise to World of Azeroth or something, I don't know. I do get the argument that the world can't just stagnate perpetually. At some point this conflict will need to be resolved, and honestly it would be bad storytelling if after everything that's happened the Horde and the Alliance just went back to warring with each other as before. That's why I think it's a bit too late to fundamentally course correct at this point. You've homogenized the people of both sides too much for it to make sense without a brand new catalyst. Okay, so let's brainstorm for a minute. If I were a lead writer at Blizzard, how would I go about injecting some of Warcraft's old DNA into its most recent iteration? And hopefully win back some of the older fans. Simply retconning everything and going back to the way things were feels lazy. You might as well just do Classic Plus at that point. One thing I just thought of is making the Alliance the more obvious aggressors this time around. And no, you don't need to tell me, I know the Alliance were never technically the good guys, but you really have to dig into the lore to see that. At a glance, it's very clearly coded who the more antagonistic faction is. So maybe an entire rebranding is in order. If we're already revamping the old world, why not lean into it when we inevitably get to the capitals? Maybe emphasize that the whole light isn't universally good aspect and make the Alliance more brutal and zealous, kind of like the Scarlet Crusade. And with the Horde still harboring a literal faction of undead, they'd have a strong justification for reigniting the conflict. Hell, I'd personally borrow from Warhammer again and make the Alliance a slightly more accepting version of the Imperium. Obviously you can't go full-on human supremacists, but you could still hint at that growing sentiment, kind of like what we saw with Garrosh and his Iron Horde, or Sylvanas. Both of them were still technically leaders of the Horde as a whole, but you could still feel the rising dissension underneath. Going even further than that, you could scrap the concept of Alliance and Horde entirely and introduce entirely new sides, maybe something like Void versus Light or along those lines. Obviously that will require a lot more resources, but it'd be an interesting way to shake things up. Since races are almost entirely cosmetic now anyway, you might as well just let players decide which side they want to fight for. If you think about it, it would also really justify the existence of Classic Plus. You wouldn't feel like you're just playing an outdated version of the same game. It would actually feel like a meaningful alternative, pushing people to try both because each offers a completely different experience. Okay, so to get back to the loose topic at hand, has Warcraft become too soft? And generally, yeah, I think so. But it's not because of one cinematic, it's a broader issue. The setting often feels like it doesn't really know what it wants to be anymore, or who it's trying to appeal to. It can't fully commit to the hopeful high fantasy direction it seems to want to lean towards because it's still tied to decades of history, but at the same time it also seems to actively want to avoid its original inspiration, so it just comes across as tonally confused. If this were a fantasy novel series, the writer would probably be accused of losing the plot, of constantly escalating the stakes without a clear thematic through line. I don't know, what do you think? I'm really curious how you guys would go about bringing Warcraft back to its roots without having to retcon most of the current lore. Or hey, if you like the direction the game is going in right now, I'd like to hear why too. This isn't a lecture, it's an open discussion, so yeah, by all means. All I ask is that we keep it respectful. And that's about all I got for now, so yeah. I'm still deciding what I want this channel to be. Right now I'm obviously talking about Warcraft, but that won't be the case for long. I honestly don't play nearly as much Warcraft as I used to. I prefer single player games these days. Just feels more fulfilling, so the next video will probably be about something else entirely. But yeah. Thanks for watching, bye!